December 7, 1941, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, a day that will live in infamy. Well, actually, FDR said date, and that's the tiniest of the many accounts recounting the attack of Pearl Harbor getting it wrong. In fact, the story you've heard about the actual events of Pearl Harbor is probably about as accurate as Michael Bay's movie. Most people know the story of Japan perpetrating a sneak attack upon the US, who had no warning that an attack on Hawaii might take place. However, the actual events went somewhat differently. Get ready for a tale of bureaucratic stalling and incompetence, endless missed opportunities, and a lack of communication so epic it rivals the most dysfunctional of reality show couples. Here are 50 insane facts about Pearl Harbor that nobody told you. Number 50. The Japanese didn't even want to go to war with the US initially, as they were more interested in China and East Asia in general. But the US viewed expansion into and attacks on China as against its own interests. That's right, the US and China were allied against Japan. It was a very different time. Number 49. Japan attacked the US mostly because of oil, which is usually the US's job. The Japanese Navy relied on US oil, and due to mounting tensions between the two countries, FDR put economic sanctions in place, froze Japanese assets in the US, and stopped metal and oil exports. In response, the Japanese doubled down on their focus on Southeast Asia, which had big mineral and oil deposits. FDR put those sanctions in place thinking it would finally convince Japan to negotiate. But as we all know, that's not exactly how things went. Number 48. The mastermind of the Pearl Harbor attack, Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, initially didn't want to go to war at all. But Emperor Hirohito was adamant that the only way forward with the US was through military action. Fun fact, Yamamoto actually studied at Harvard and had been part of the Japanese military attaché of Washington, D.C. Being a realist, he was well aware of the vast differences between the military and industrial capabilities of Japan and the US, and did not think a war would ultimately go in Japan's favor. Number 47. However, with his emperor insisting and many of the generals set on the warpath already, Yamamoto decided the only way to effectively attack the US would be with a quick, damaging, and decisive airstrike with little to no warning. And that's when he came up with his plan to attack Pearl Harbor, damaging US naval and other military capabilities in the Pacific theater. Yamamoto estimated that an attack on Pearl Harbor would give Japan 6 months to accomplish their aims in Southeast Asia without US interference. Number 46. The initial inspiration for the attack came from a book. The book wasn't 101 Ways to Declare War on a Superpower, but rather British naval officer Hector Bywater's novel, The Great Pacific War. The plot of the book described a fictional conflict in which Japan would attack the US naval fleet, followed up by an attack on Guam and the Philippines. Reading about this imaginary operation was one thing, but on November 11, 1940, the British Royal Air Force took out the Italian naval ships stationed at Taranto, proving in Yamamoto's mind that an aerial attack against a superior fleet could be successfully executed. Number 45. If you paid attention to the previous date, you might wonder why Yamamoto was inspired by an attack that occurred well over a year in advance of Pearl Harbor. Well, that's because Japan started planning the destruction of Pearl Harbor at least 11 months in advance. If only the US could have known. Well, actually, number 44. The impressively mustachioed US ambassador to Japan, Joseph Grew, tried to warn the US of an impending attack on Pearl Harbor in January 1941. At a great risk to his own life, stationed inside what was about to be enemy territory, Grew sent the information to Washington, D.C. In response, the president and the top military brass didn't believe him. They thought a Japanese attack was possible, but they assumed the land of the rising sun would attack the US military in the Philippines, a much closer target, rather than crossing most of the Pacific Ocean unnoticed to take out a Hawaiian base. Number 43. In fact, the government thought Grew's warning was so ludicrous they didn't even bother to send a warning to Pearl Harbor or any military installation for that matter. And unfortunately, it would not be the first time Grew would be ignored, each time with awful consequences, but we'll get to that later. Number 42. One small but ridiculous fact before we keep going. The initial Japanese codename for the attack was Operation Hawaii, which seems so comically obvious that if any communication or papers were intercepted, the US really should have had a heads up. Perhaps after someone with an ounce of common sense figured that out, the codename was then changed to Operation Z. Number 41. In February of 1941, the newly appointed head of Pearl Harbor, Admiral Kimmel, as well as General Short, assessed the capabilities and defenses of the base. Kimmel exclaimed that he thought the defenses in place were inadequate and requested that Washington, D.C. send additional help and reinforcements. In response, Washington said, "Thank you, don't call us, we'll call you." Or, "Oops," they said, "we'll consider the request." Then they proceeded to do absolutely nothing. Number 40. The U.S. cracked the Japanese code used for diplomatic messages, JN-25, in April of 1941. But just in case you thought massive incompetence was limited to the American side, the very next month, Japanese Admiral Nomura caught on and informed the Japanese military that the U.S. had been reading his messages. However, the brass in Tokyo believed that the code was unbreakable. Therefore, Nomura must be wrong. They proceeded to make no changes to the code. The U.S. keeps on reading Japanese correspondence and eventually learns that… Number 39. Officials in Tokyo requested a grid of military locations from the Japanese ambassador in Honolulu. This became known as the bomb plot. Stumbling upon this piece of shocking communication, the codebreakers related to Washington to see what could be done with the information. Their superiors tell them they'll think it over and proceed to send a full team of… Just kidding, they did absolutely nothing. Certainly not something as simple as, warning Admiral Kimmel and General Short of the potential danger to the Pearl Harbor base. Number 38. At some point in the fall of 1941, Ambassador Joseph Grew, sensing that the situation in Tokyo is rapidly deteriorating and war is in the air, hears the Japanese Prime Minister, Fumimaro Konoe, a somewhat more reasonable figure than the emperor, has invited President Roosevelt to meet with him in the Pacific to see what could be done to avoid war. Grew begs FDR to accept the invitation, but Roosevelt brushes it off. The ambassador, trying until the very last moment to keep peace between the two nations, warns Roosevelt and Secretary of State Cordell Hull via telegram the U.S. government is making a potentially fatal mistake, completely failing to read the room. Number 37. Washington sends out a war warning, their first and only heads up to Kimmel and Short in Pearl Harbor, that a Japanese attack may occur soon, possibly somewhere in the Pacific. Of course, the officers are still led to believe that the possibility of an imminent full-scale attack on Hawaii is slim to none. Number 36. On December 6th, one of the last deciphered messages indicates Japan will be attacking Pearl Harbor by the next morning. FDR and his advisors scoff at the suggestion, insisting Japan would do no such thing without declaring war first. Number 35. In fact, even though Yamamoto didn't initially want to declare war and give the U.S. a warning, he starts to think attacking without a heads-up will anger the American government and public even more. So he decides to send a declaration at least half an hour before the Pearl Harbor attack. Though to be honest, we're not sure how killing a bunch of U.S. military personnel and civilians while sinking battleships will go down any smoother with a half-hour warning. Number 34. If you've ever dealt with government offices before, you won't be surprised to hear that the Japanese embassy severely delayed the transmission by an hour, meaning the attack actually happened right before war was declared. As Yamamoto predicted, this caused the U.S. to see the Japanese action as a cowardly sneak attack, enraging the American public, which up to that point had no burning desire to get involved in another world war. Number 33. Fortunately, U.S. codebreakers did actually intercept the declaration of war. However, inter-service rivalries between the U.S. Army and the Navy delayed any warnings getting sent out to the military leaders or bases. And unsurprisingly, for anyone who's ever attempted to study Japanese, the wording in the Japanese declaration of war was also quite ambiguous, causing a further delay in communication. Number 32. In the meantime, the Japanese military was traveling 3,400 miles across the Pacific to execute their attack on Pearl Harbor. So how did the U.S. not see them at any point? Well, first of all, the fleet didn't use radios to communicate with Japan at all, so the transmissions could not be intercepted. Instead, to communicate with each other, they used signal flags, spotlights, and Morse code. Number 31. In addition, contrary to the story usually told, U.S. radar did pick up the Japanese, but they didn't realize it. Radar was still a relatively new technology, and procedures for how to use it and respond to potential sightings were still unclear. The personnel who saw the planes on their radar dismissed the sighting, as the base was expecting some B-17 heavy bombers to arrive soon and assumed the radar had picked up those planes. Number 30. Lastly, the Japanese were somewhat lucky in using a storm front approaching Hawaii as a shield, traveling behind it so patrol planes couldn't see them. Number 29. That being said, the first air fleet of Japan did send some plane scouts ahead of the incoming fighters, bombers, and aircraft carriers. Locals in Hawaii saw them flying overhead, but at the time Pearl Harbor didn't have a no-fly zone over it, and small civilian planes flying over Oahu was such a common occurrence that no one really paid any attention. Number 28. Did you know that technically Americans fired the first shot of the attack? The USS Ward got word that a periscope was spotted peeking out over the water, and identified a Japanese submarine at the entrance to the harbor, which it then fired on. Unfortunately, that word comes up a lot in the lead to Pearl Harbor. The district commandant assumed the submarine was on its own, and other Navy commanders didn't take the USS Ward's report seriously. In fact, the USS Ward wouldn't even get confirmation that they sank the sub until 60 years later. We assume it was delivered to them in their nursing homes. All of that meant that, number 27, when the bombing of Pearl Harbor started, the men on the base were left completely unprepared. Even Japanese commander Mitsuo Fuchida didn't believe that the attack actually took the US completely by surprise, shouting "Tora, Tora, Tora," which means tiger in Japanese, confirming to the rest of his side that they had succeeded in surprising the Americans with the attack. Number 26. The American defense plans ironically resulted in more damage. Planes were lined up on the runway in neat rows, as the base wanted them to be ready and easily accessible for mobilization and patrol. Unfortunately, it also made the mission of the Japanese bombers much easier, as they could shoot the fighter planes out in the open instead of having to breach the armored hangars that they would have normally been kept in. Number 25. Not only that, but since defense plans had been focused on potential sabotage rather than a full-scale attack, the base's anti-aircraft guns, or AA guns, were locked in armories with the ammunition stored elsewhere. Therefore, mobilizing those guns to bring down the Japanese fighters took much longer than it should have. Number 24. The incoming fighters targeted the grand battleships of the US Navy. They fired 8 torpedoes into the USS Oklahoma, which capsized 2 minutes after the bombing began, essentially trapping its sailors in an underwater prison. Number 23. Of all the battleships attacked, the USS Arizona sustained the most damage and casualties. That's partly because the ship had filled up on fuel the day before, carrying nearly 1.5 million gallons at the time of the attack. When the Arizona was hit by torpedoes, the massive amounts of fuel it was carrying amplified the explosions and the fires aboard the ship. Number 22. In fact, the USS Arizona was loaded up with so much fuel that it's still seeping out of the ship today, with around 9 quarts of oil leaking into Pearl Harbor daily from the ship's underwater tomb. Number 21. All that leaking oil meant that many of the sailors who jumped into the sea couldn't escape because the oil released from the damaged battleships caught fire on the surface of the water, so the sailors who went overboard started burning and drowning at the same time. A horrific image. Number 20. The attack lasted a total of 1 hour and 15 minutes and came in 2 separate waves and ended up killing over 2,400 Americans, including some civilians, and destroyed more than 180 aircraft. The USS Arizona and Oklahoma were sunk and damaged beyond repair. Of a total of 2,206 American service members killed at Pearl Harbor, 1,606 were aboard those 2 ships. Number 19. However, while the scale of this tragedy is truly mind-boggling, it's a little-known fact that the attack could have been much worse. A combination of certain heroic actions on the American side, coupled with some luck, kept the Japanese from inflicting even more damage. For starters, there was supposed to be a 3rd wave of attacks targeting infrastructure, but the Japanese Admiral Nagumo canceled it, partly thanks to the fact that the anti-aircraft guns were being brought out and were posing a bigger danger to Japanese planes, and partly due to low fuel on the Japanese side. The 3rd wave could have had significant long-term effects, such as destroying the fuel depot of Pearl Harbor and, unbeknownst to the Japanese, the underground code-cracking base stationed there, which would have likely extended the war by 2 years. Number 18. The Japanese damaged or sunk all 8 battleships stationed at the harbor. However, all but the Arizona and Oklahoma were resurfaced and repaired. Because the 3rd wave of attacks didn't materialize, most of the base's facilities were left intact. Most of the ships were sunk right next to the base's naval repair station, which remained intact and ready to get the Navy's battleships back into action. Number 17. In addition, thankfully for the US, the aircraft carriers usually stationed at the base had all been sent out to sea for undisclosed missions at Midway Island, Wake Island, and other Pacific locations. This meant they all remained unharmed, enabling the US to rebuild its military capabilities much faster after the attack, and eventually help win the war via air power. Number 16. Due to the fact that it was a Sunday, as part of the Japanese plan had involved attacking the base on a Sunday to catch the service members off guard, most of the senior commanding officers were not on base and reassumed command immediately after the attack. Number 15. One young and confused Japanese fighter made a mistake and dropped a torpedo on the USS Utah, which was decommissioned at the time. 5 other pilots decided to quickly follow suit, wasting 6 torpedoes on a ship that was never going to go into action. However, this still resulted in a loss of life on the Utah, but Number 14. Most of the people on board, about 30 officers and 431 men, survived the sinking of the Utah, thanks in part to the heroic actions of a few service members. First among them was Chief Water Tender Peter Tomic, a Croatian immigrant and dedicated sailor who decided to ignore his evacuation order to secure the ship's boilers, knowing that damage to the boilers would result in further explosions and a massive loss of life. With this mission in mind, he sprinted down to access the boiler room, running further into the belly of the ship instead of evacuating away from the incoming torpedoes. He quickly assessed the situation, resetting gauges, releasing steam, and stabilizing the boilers themselves to keep them in place. Miraculously, his quick actions worked, and there were no explosions, though Tomic unfortunately did not survive the attack and went down with the Utah. He was posthumously awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for his brave feat. Number 13. John B. Vason, serving in the Utah's electrical division, suddenly heard bombs dropping and felt the ship starting to shift, ready to capsize. He made a swift and potentially deadly decision to stay at his post and keep the lights working as long as possible in order to help his brothers in arms evacuate the ship. Vason became trapped in the Utah's hull for 3 hours as it overturned, and after he had done all he could to help the rest of the men, he started banging on the hull hoping someone would hear him. Warrant Officer Machinist Stanley Szymanski and Chief Machinist Terrence McElwinney heard the banging on the metal hull and rushed to the nearby USS Tangier and USS Raleigh to request help. Working together, the men cut a hole in the bottom of the ship and extracted Vason. Eventually, Vason would be awarded the Navy Cross for his actions, with his rescuers getting letters of commendation. Number 12. Pilots Ken Taylor and George Welch were credited with at least 7 of the 29 Japanese aircraft being brought down by American guns. Taylor and Welch heard gunfire early in the morning and looked outside their Hawaiian homes to see what was going on. Upon seeing the Japanese planes with their signature red circles painted on the side, they phoned and told the base to arm and fuel their P-40s. Welch was recommended for the Medal of Honor for his heroism, but he was denied the medal because his commanding officer said he had taken off without orders. Of course, we think it was understandable given the circumstances, but let us know what you think. Number 11. Another hero not often heard about was Joseph George. Based on the USS Vestal, he managed to save 6 men's lives from the USS Arizona command tower. While the Arizona was burning, the situation of the men high up in the tower seemed completely hopeless. Unable to get down, they looked over to their neighboring ship and screamed for help. George, disobeying the orders of his commanding officer, threw a rope over to the tower to enable the men to evacuate, one by one, and make their way over to the Vestal. The last man reached the deck of the Vestal just as the inferno on the Arizona burned through the rope, falling into the oil and fire-covered ocean. Number 10. In total, 15 men received the U.S. Navy Medal of Honor, and 51 Navy Crosses were awarded for heroism. The brave actions of the men on the ground, though they could not completely make up for the grave errors made at the top of the chain of command, saved a lot of people that might have otherwise perished. Number 9. Americans actually captured a Japanese POW that day, the first of the war, by the name of Kazuo Sakamaki. He was managing a midget-class sub which was disabled during the attack, resulting in Sakamaki trying to blow it up with an explosive charge. The charge also failed, and when the submariner dove down to try to fix his ship, he passed out and eventually floated to the surface. It just really wasn't Sakamaki's day. When he washed up on shore, the US captured him and took him as a prisoner of war, and he wasn't released until the end of World War II, after which he went on to work for Toyota and died an old man in 1999. Number 8. Shortly after the attack, FDR gave his famous speech about the date that will live in infamy. However, a small bit of trivia, this date is actually different for the two powers involved thanks to the international date line, as the Japanese memorialize Pearl Harbor on December 8th while the US does so on December 7th. Number 7. Germany was not aware of Japan's plan to attack Pearl Harbor. FDR's administration was still hesitant to declare war against all Axis powers, so they only declared war against Japan. That is, until Germany and Italy themselves declared war against the US on December 11th, prompting FDR to retaliate by declaring war back. Number 6. The Pearl Harbor attack did actually achieve the Japanese aim of accomplishing their goals in the Pacific, as they overran Southeast Asia within 6 months. However, after the US had time to rebuild its force, partly thanks to the preservation of its aircraft carriers and infrastructure at Pearl Harbor, it started to push Japan back and turn the tide of the war. Number 5. The Japanese actually attempted a second attack on Pearl Harbor a few months later, on March 4, 1942, presumably to halt the American repair and buildup of forces occurring at the time. Called Operation K, they sent 4 naval flying boats loaded with bombers to the harbor. However, the base staff had learned from previous mistakes and immediately spotted the incoming flying boats on radar, alerting air defenses to go patrol the harbor and keep them out. The mission ultimately failed as bad weather led to 2 of the flying boats dropping bombs into the ocean and on an unpopulated hillside, while the other 2 never got through U.S. defenses. Number 4. The U.S. understandably held a grudge against the mastermind behind the attack, Yamamoto, and eventually targeted him with Operation Vengeance. Codebreakers intercepted a message informing them that the admiral was planning on doing a flying tour of Southeast Asia. American P-38 Lightnings intercepted Yamamoto's plane and shot it down near Rabaul in Papua New Guinea. Number 3. In the aftermath of the attack, the senior officers of the base, Kimmel and Short, were relieved of command, found in dereliction of duty, and found by a government commission to be solely responsible for the attack at Pearl Harbor, even though the government never gave them any information about the incoming attacks or responded to their support request. They just needed a scapegoat for the warnings they ignored and their lack of action. Both Kimmel and Short died without their names ever being cleared. Later on, an act by Congress requested they be posthumously restored to full rank, but no president has yet approved it. Number 2. Today, scientists are actually worried about a potential local ecological disaster as the oil tanks of the USS Arizona may collapse, meaning that the leaking fuel will completely overwhelm the sea in the harbor. Number 1. We left the best for last. In a surprising turn of events, the Pearl Harbor Memorial centered around the sunk USS Arizona has become a popular destination for Japanese tourists. Japanese tourism has been quite high in Hawaii for a while now, and apparently many incoming travelers make sure to stop by the Pearl Harbor Memorial to pay their respects. Now watch What If Kamikaze Pilot Survived, or watch this video instead.